Okay, so today we're going to talk about building anticipation in your writing, and we're going to be talking about 4 different ways that you can do that. Obviously, there are a lot more than 4, but these are the most common 4. So as a result, we're going to deep dive into these particular 4. Surprise, suspense, humor, and that may not seem like a way to build anticipation, but I will explain when I get there, and then promises to your reader. So let's start with surprise. So if I can get it all, there we go. At least most of it. Alright, so with surprise, this one is kind of obvious as far as how to build anticipation. It is just to cause astonishment or shock to your reader, and this astonishment and shock can definitely lead to anticipation, because if you do surprises right, then you're building towards the surprise. So even though it's a surprise, the reason the surprise is good is because it doesn't come out of nowhere. The thing about good surprises is that they actually are foreshadowed, but they're foreshadowed so subtly that you almost miss it. But if you go back, you're like, I see it there. And your reader can do the same thing. It's kind of like in Sherlock Holmes or Psych or some of those mystery type shows where it seems like nothing connects, but then when the person goes back, they explain it all to you, and you're like, yep, that was totally here the whole time, even though it came as a surprise to you at the time. The reason that I say to be wary of this is probably purely because of the fact that people think surprise just means coming out of nowhere. And like I said, it needs to be at least subtly foreshadowed. It shouldn't be in your face. Don't slap them with the hints. Just, kind of leave a subtle hint. It's kind of like perfume, You want to do about a squirt of perfume to make you, smell fancy, but you don't want to like dump the whole bottle in your head. That's kind of the difference here. Because of you also want to be aware of the fact that with surprise, you definitely have to foreshadow. And I know I've said this again and again, but the reason I'm emphasizing it is because if you don't foreshadow, then it will feel like Deus Ex Machina. Deus Ex Machina is when something just comes completely out of nowhere and changes the whole course of the story. And if you don't properly foreshadow it, then it feels like you're cheating as a writer. It feels like you're just jumping ahead. Yes?
So, if you're reading a mystery and the person, that's writing it leaves out a major clue, and then later on they say, so actually there was this clue here.
Yes, that it would be Deus Ex Machina, where they're like, so I didn't tell you earlier, but I noticed earlier that the sister was watering her garden and those plants are all poisonous, and so clearly she was the murderer. It's like, that's a big problem. We should have known that beforehand. Absolutely, that is a great example. So you got to make sure that you're not leaving out clues, or if you are leaving out clues, you are showing it in a way that is subtle, like I said. So for example, if you have her watering the garden, but you don't directly say they are poisonous flowers, you just are like, oh, why did they include that detail? And then later they're like, this is why I included that detail. So definitely don't leave important stuff out if you're building up a surprise. Another way that you can do surprise really well is to shift viewpoint. That way you can get an entirely different narrator for the story. Even if you're doing third person, it'll shift how you're writing it. And as a result, you'll see new things. For example, if you write a story from X point of view, and then you change it to Y point of view, maybe Y point of view is the murderer. And so you're like, oh boy, you start seeing things from a different point of view, and maybe you even start realizing why they're a murderer. Maybe they, were doing the right thing, and this person was, a terrible person. So yes, they murdered someone, but they were a terrible person. And so you're like, who's the good guy here? You start questioning that. Hello, guys. The next thing is to move from micro to macro. When working on surprises, it can be really beneficial to go super in detail on certain things that are important, but then make sure that you do super in detail on each of these things, and then you zoom out to give the full picture of why each of these details matters. So kind of like the clue thing we were talking about earlier. With a good mystery, generally the micro to macro is a great way to give a surprise. For example, and then there were none. I won't spoil anything, but they do a really good job of this with Agatha Christie's writing. how she will hone in on a specific character's backstory. And as she hones in on each of these characters' backstories, you're like, honestly, any of them could be the murderer. Any of them could be the murderer. It just, why not? And then as she moves from micro to macro, the bigger picture, then you start seeing, oh, well, it couldn't be her because of this, and it couldn't be him because of this, and you start whittling down your answers. But you whittle it down just enough that you're still uncertain, and she makes sure that she leaves out just enough that you don't know until she says it, and then when she says it, there's this surprise because you're like, oh, I should have seen that coming, but at the same time, you didn't. You want your reader to have that reaction. I should have seen it coming, but you didn't. You don't want them to have the, wow, I didn't see that coming at all. Because then that means you did something wrong. Because then they're thoroughly confused. And you don't want your reader to be confused. Number one rule of being a writer, do not confuse your poor reader. If your reader is confused, they're just going to be sad.
What if we want them to be confused and that?
Then it's going to be a really terrible book, probably. Sorry. But maybe, feel free to take me up on the challenge, write the most confusing sad book in the entire planet. And make it good somehow, but at the same time.
Sad I got you. Confusing not as much.
Wait, that should be our next one. Trying competition.
Oh man, I think that'd be too hard. Too difficult, man.
Oh, well, it'll be fine.
Alright, so the next thing is follow your writer's instincts. Now, some of you may not know this term, or if you do know this term, I'm just going to explain it anyway. With writer's instincts, it is your best gut feeling. With this gut feeling, yes, you can always go back and fix it later. That's what editing is for. So if you're like, oh, this would be a great surprise, I totally see this, but you didn't foreshadow it earlier, no problem. Just put the surprise in, go back and edit it later so the surprise is properly foreshadowed. Brandon Sanderson actually does this all the time. That's his method. He doesn't foreshadow. You wonder why his foreshadowing is so great? Because he goes back and does it later. So don't feel like super stressed and like, oh no, if I don't foreshadow it right, no, don't worry about it. Just go with what feels right as you're writing.
I remember, like, even looking back on the fourth Fablehaven book, and for Fablehaven book, I'm like, I did not see Gavin.
Yep. That was a big one for sure. But then when you look back, you're kind of like, I guess, you start like putting things together, and that's what a good surprise is. You don't see it coming, and then later you're like, I mean, maybe.
You were randomly dropped into it.
Yeah, that's fair.
Oh my gosh, get over it.
All right, so the next thing we're going to talk about, oh boy, my marker's dying. No, don't die
Rest
on
in
the
peace.
marker. I don't think we have another marker, but I'm still going to try. There we go.
I
So,
should just bring
suspense.
whiteboard markers.
And obviously, I'm going to still explain it, but there's a reason why suspense is important. Oh gosh, you can't see that at all. There we go. You can kind of see it. Alright, so there's this feeling anxious for what will happen next, making your reader die to want to read more. They're like, I can't bear this. You're leaving me on a cliffhanger every chapter. They just want to keep reading. So the first thing with suspense is tease your readers, but never give them the answer directly. So this is kind of similar to the clue. You want it to be subtle. You want to make sure that when you give them a particular point in the story, you're kind of like, I'm going to tease it so-and-so being the murderer, but obviously they can be because they're their best friend. And then you're like, but still fishy. And so that keeps you reading because you're like, why is the best friend so fishy? And you're like, I want to know.
It's because he's planning a birthday party, but he's like...
He's planning a birthday party, but
no one can know.
But no one can know. See, there you go. But you never give them the answer directly. You don't purposely have them, look through their phone and then be like, oh, ready for the party this weekend. And they're like, oh, well, I already solved it. That's not suspenseful. Suspenseful is dragging your reader along with hints and wisps of things. It's kind of like an escape room. You have all these riddles and things that are going to lead you to the next clue, but not directly. They're not saying the next clue is in the safe over there. They're saying, maybe it's in something red, and there's 4 red things, and you have to go check all 4 red things.
There's numbers on a stick over here. Well, there's a phone right there. There's a 15 different padlocks.
Yep, exactly.
Okay.
So it's subtle. It's never direct with suspense. The next good point is flashbacks. This is a great way to build suspense by having them put pieces together like a puzzle. Now, the only thing you want to be careful with flashbacks is you got to make sure that the reader isn't confused. You got to make it very clear that it is a flashback. Otherwise, they're going to not know what time it is, and it's going to be very confusing.
Everything italicized, optional, change the sense from like first person to third person or vice versa.
Yes. Or even just directly say, I remembered one time, and then go into it.
Yeah.
You got to make sure it's very clear. Unfortunately, with flashbacks, you cannot be subtle, where it's like, oh yes, and the smell of metal came to my nose, and now all of a sudden I'm having a flashback about bank robbery, and you're like, why are we at a bank? We were just at a ballroom. You got to make sure the transition is very clear.
Yeah, scent of metal wafted into my nose, and I was remembering of
Yes.
1952 in Seattle.
Exactly. That makes it sound like one of those noir comics. But anyway,
Yes.
So with flashbacks, it helps make it feel like a puzzle because you got this piece over here, and then you got this piece all the way over here, and you got to figure out why they go together. That's why this can be so suspenseful. The next point is putting a clock on it, also known as, putting a bomb in the room. So basically, you have to have some reason they have to solve it by X time. So for example, everyone came from all around the world to this conference, and then someone got murdered. And if they don't solve it by midnight, everyone's leaving to their own country. Therefore, you will never find the murderer. And it's like, okay, that's intense. There's a lot more to this now, where if it was like, oh yeah, we have about 5 months to solve this murder, then there's no suspense there, right? There's no anticipation for the reader. Yes?
We have 30 minutes until the aliens take over.
Exactly!
Destroy
What are we
the
gonna
Earth.
do about it, guys? That helps give anticipation, give suspense, because you're like, oh crap, the aliens are coming in 30 minutes, now what? Or in the case of, like, for example, the bomb in the room, you're, a spy, and you're like, oh, we have plenty of time to get out of here, and then it's like, JK, there's a bomb under your chair with a 4-minute timer, now we only have 4 minutes to get out of this room, and it's like, oh no.
And there are 37 locks, and you have to get through each one in 4 minutes.
Right.
I know the safest box in the world.
Blowtorch. In general, the reason that suspense is so important in building anticipation is because it helps you feel like you're in the shoes of the character. You're so invested in making sure they get it out alive, and you gotta make sure that there is actually something at stake. Sorry, this is what Disney movies actually have started to learn. They realized that for a while, the whole happily ever after everyone lives thing,
Is dead.
then everyone knows they're all gonna live, so there's no suspense, right? There's no suspense if you're like, everyone's gonna live.
And
But
they
if
all
you
die.
are
Sadly, everyone.
unsure whether anyone could die at any second, that is far more anticipation. Your reader's like, no, my cinnamon roll, you can't kill him. Whereas with the other one, it's like, he'll be fine. That makes them put the book down versus keep the book until 2 a.m.
Yes.
All right.
I've done that so many times. Like,
Right.
put so many all-nighters just with
Oh.
a flashlight and a book.
Yes, books, the
I
best.
swear I'm saying sleep.
Sleep.
Who
What
needs
sleep?
it? I'm not.
All right. So the last thing about suspense that we're going to talk about is make sure to include red herrings as well as your muddled clues. The reason this breeds even more anticipation is kind of like you said. Maybe it's between 2 people, and 2 people are acting super fishy, and the first one is just planning a surprise party, and that's why they're acting super fishy, but you're 100% sure they're the murderer, because it couldn't be so-and-so, even though they're acting super fishy, and then of course it's like, guess what, it was so-and-so, and now he's stabbing you. It's like, you gotta make sure that you have a couple false clues in there. However, make sure that your false clues are pretty obviously false clues, not entirely obvious, but pretty obvious. Make them muddled enough that you're like, there's a gray zone here. I feel like it could be either. Don't make it very clearly, oh yes, and you're sure they're the murderer. Why are you so freaking sure? It's like, okay, that makes it far less interesting, whereas it makes it far more interesting if you're like, I really have no idea who the murderer is. It could be so-and-so, or so-and-so could be about to stab me at any second.
It could be my best friend, or it could be a person that I never met.
You don't want.
It's
Fair
my
enough.
best
You
friend.
don't want to be your characters being like, it was you. No, I'm not the murderer. He's the murderer. Look, he's got a knife.
He's
He has
got
a knife.
So
No, he's not gonna kill us with the knife. The knife. He was just sharpening that knife.
so we were playing
just murdered you.
version of Mafia in math,
Yes,
and
Mafia is a great example of this.
and one of my classmates, her friend, quote unquote, died.
Mhm.
And she's like, how could it be me? I'm her best friend. I wouldn't do that. And it was her the entire time.
Exactly.
And so when I died and I could see who it was, and I'm like, dude, that was amazing.
Right? Exactly. You got to do things to throw them off your scent. And let's all be real here. And I know this is going to sound really sketchy, but if we were all real criminals, wouldn't we do the same thing? We'd want to throw them off our scent. And be like, clearly it's so-and-so. Couldn't possibly be me.
Yeah.
Or at least
Don't-
if you're a good criminal.
I
If you're
swear
one
I'm
criminal
like,
to be super dumb, then maybe actually
Like,
have
I'll
them
be
be
like,
dumb.
it's them, I swear, they're a cop, they have a gun. And a 7-foot
But they're also a cop.
But they're also a cop.
Cops don't usually corrupt.
Don't
like,
usually.
yes, they
What?
happen, but they don't usually corrupt.
Yep.
But then again, you're on a 19th
All right.
show.
So we're gonna move on to humor. Now this might sound interesting with building anticipation, but I'm gonna explain. With humor, it's all about building up to a good joke, right? It's about building up that joy in your reader until it finally just spills out and they can't help but laugh, right? So as a result, it's just a different type of anticipation. Instead of everyone's gonna die, it's more like, I can't wait. This is gonna be so great when he meets her and then they figure out that they're secretly dating online. You know, that's an anticipation too. It's just more of a joyful anticipation. You're just waiting for the moment. You're like, dude, I can't wait. This is gonna be so awkward. And so you laugh because of it. With humor, don't try too hard. Kind of let it flow naturally. Your sense of humor, keeping this in mind, won't appeal to everyone. But that's not a bad thing. That means that you all have a very specific audience. That's the best part about humor, is that your audience will love it. And if other people don't love it, that's okay.
Slap. Yes.
But
Just
in
raise your hand
general,
for the-
if you let it flow naturally, it will be far funnier than if you're like, I spent the whole book setting up for this joke. It's like, oh boy,
It's
that's a lot of
just
pressure.
dad joke and they're just awkwardly
Yes,
silent.
it's just a dad joke and crickets. Chirping. Yeah, no, you gotta make sure you just let it flow naturally. Let there be some rises and falls, you know. Let there be a really bad joke and then a really good joke. You gotta have a little bit of everything.
Is that the plot of the book?
The next point is write things that are either relatable or go totally the opposite, and write things that are completely wild and blown out of proportion. So for example, you could write something very relatable, like, oh man, like Charlie Brown, for instance. The reason why Charlie Brown is so funny is because even though it's sad, we're all like, dude, we all have days like that. You know, you're like, sometimes life just sucks. And that's why it's so funny. Whereas you can go the totally opposite way too and write something that's completely wild and blown out of proportion, like someone trying to fight a dragon and they're like, we can't fight this dragon because he's breathing fire. And they're like, well, what if we snuck into his food and had him eat us and then we tried to like kill him from the inside? And it's like, why?
Guys, this juices anyone.
But at the same time, that's why you're kind of like, wow, that is not the way I saw that going. That is totally the opposite, but that's why it's humorous, right?
Yeah. Physics, respect it, please.
So you gotta make sure that either you're going relatable and real and making sure that people can connect with your jokes in a way that they can relate to, or make sure that it's completely so wild that there's no way they can relate and that's why they're like, the heck, dude? But that's why it's funny. Next thing is keep your jokes short and well timed. So if you're going to do a joke And it's not just like the scene is funny because the situation is humorous and funny, like I was talking about earlier, where they don't know they're secretly dating because they have fake identities or whatever. That's more like a funny scene, right? But if you're doing an actual joke where there's like a punchline, make sure it's short and well timed. The best jokes aren't convoluted and confusing. They're just kind of like, why the chicken across the road? Because Kentucky Fried Chicken. I don't know. It's gonna be like super short and to the point.
Yeah, it's like, Miss Bourne actually does a really good job of this. I'm gonna spoil a little bit, but suck it. So pretty much, there's this one character who has this like street slang that like no one can understand what he's saying.
Yep. I love
him so
He's great.
much. And they're like, dude, talk normally, and then
Just
he,
please.
and then some of the other main characters like join in on the street slang. So one of the characters turns to his neighbor and he's like, I think our friends have gone insane. And then he says something in the street slang, and I giggled for like 2 minutes.
It's true. Just keep it short and see, that's short and well timed. It's like one concise little scene, right?
Yeah.
As I remember. So with that, it's important that if you're gonna do a joke, make sure it's punchy, it's quick, it's not long and drawn out. The only time long and drawn out is okay is if it's situational humor. In which case you're like, yes, let's milk all the awkward out of this and make it super awkward.
Yeah, like those moments where it's like, oh yeah, bye. It's like my car's that way.
And so you guys keep walking together? Yes, the very awkward moment where
Oh
you're
my
like,
gosh, that one Studio
Bye.
C sketch.
actually, okay. Yes, and Studio C, that's why it's so funny too, is because there's
Oh
a
my
long situational humor, right? But there's also these funny, well-timed jokes in between it.
It's just their
Yeah.
comedy is a yes.
Yeah, like the
It's
props
good.
for
It's good with humor to have an
Gosh,
overarching
yeah.
humor, but also to have little jokes in between it to keep you dragged along, kind of like those clues. Drug along. Just
Yeah,
sounds
drugged
weird.
along.
drugged along. You done been drugged. All right.
I remember I read a book,
Mhm.
murder mystery book, and they had like such great like suspension.
Mhm.
And basically like these people are getting murdered off the train, and this girl's trying to find it out.
Mhm.
And then at the end of the book, you learn that the girl's boyfriend was doing it, and he tries to oof her.
Oh, yeesh. But see, that's why it's a good surprise or a good situational humor where you're like, did not, what?
But he was like the funny guy, so you grew to like like
Right,
him.
so you
and
liked
then
him,
at
and
the
then
very
it's,
end,
yeah, that's what makes it good. Suspense and humor can be well blended. That is definitely true. Especially with suspense and humor, if you have a dark suspense, it's called gallows humor. Gallows humor is actually very important for building anticipation in your reader, because sometimes if you're building up too much anticipation, the reader can be like, this is too much. I have to put the book down or I'm going to have a heart attack. And so gallows humor can actually be incredibly important in building anticipation, because you're building up that anticipation still, but it has just enough humor that your reader doesn't feel like they're in mortal danger by reading this book. They're like, oh, well, I kind of got a laugh out of that, but they're like, but there's still a murderer on the loose, you know? And so you have the overarching anticipation and suspense of, say, a murderer, but then you have the little bits of humor that make you kind of be like, meh, you know, not take it too seriously. And it helps lighten the mood of your reader or viewer a bit. For example, Psych is a really great example of this. I know not everyone watches that show, but the whole point, yes, if you've seen it, you know that the whole point is that he is pretending to be a psychic, but he's basically just a child at heart. He's a total dork. But that's why you love him as a character. You're like, yes, dork. He's fantastic. But the whole time he's trying to solve these murders, and they're these grisly, like, scary murders, right? But the whole time he's chasing the murderer, he's totally willing to make jokes with his best friend. Like, for example, in one of the episodes, they think that a mummy did it, right? Of course, mummy didn't do it. But they think a mummy did it. And his best friend keeps disappearing anytime they mention the word mummy and freaking out and running off. And he's like, come on, dude, wait, stop. And totally teasing him all the time and being like, come on, man up, guy. I need your help. And so it gives this kind of gallows humor where you're like laughing because of the fact that there's this comedic relationship with these two best friends, but then you're also not relieving too much anticipation because you're still worried there's a murderer out there. What are we going to do? So gallows humor is one of my very favorite things, and I would say absolutely use it. It helps make it more universal. Not everyone likes their pants being scared off in the middle of the night. Some people love horror. Absolutely. If you want to write horror, go for it. But at the same time, not everyone likes horror. So gallows humor can be a great way to make it friendly for everyone. Because almost everyone likes humor, not everyone likes horror that scares the freaking crap out of them.
I like it.
So even
Yeah, and that's totally
I
fine.
read scary stories in the middle of the
No,
night.
even
If you love
don't-
scary stories, that is absolutely your thing, and go for it by all means, but not everyone does. See, that's the whole thing. Out of like, what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 people in the room? Yes?
There was like this Stephen King
Mhm.
movie that they were gonna release recently, but they couldn't because the people
Yes.
who were watching it in the previews were screaming too much.
It was too scary.
I think that that's an example of like when you could have added in some like humor or something. I
Mhm.
mean, like
To relieve some of that scariness, that
because,
anticipation. I agree, I saw that
if
review.
you're just like on edge the entire time.
Oh, yeah.
You're just gonna be like, this is too much. I
Yeah.
just can't take it anymore.
Right.
But if
That's what I
you're on the edge most of the time,
Mhm.
but then sometimes you kind of scooch back a little bit. It like relieves the pressure, but
Yes.
still keeps you just close enough to the edge that you're like, I want to keep reading.
Exactly. Keeping them on the edge, but at the same time not so on the edge that they feel like they themselves are in mortal danger. And like I said, some people love that. 1 person out of 6 people in this room absolutely loves that though. But that's why I say it's a niche genre. Lots of people love it, absolutely. But it's about 1 in 6.
Yeah.
Which is still a lot of people. But if you want it to appeal to a little bit more, humor can help. Absolutely. Because yes, there's nothing wrong with a really good horror novel. I personally am not a huge fan of horror, but I know some people who die-hard horror fans. So by all means, I think being a horror fan is awesome, just not for me. I'm a scared cat.
Yeah.
All right.
If you don't like horror and still love an amazing storyline, Sixth Sense.
Oh, gotcha.
It's so good. It's like the first and only thriller I am ever going to watch because like that takes the cake. It's so good.
Fair enough. All right. The next thing that we're going to talk about is reader promises. Now, in general, promises are obviously something that binds you in a contract to another person or entity. And when I say contract, this can be just, I owe you cake if you win this contest, or it can be something as serious as, I absolutely promise to pay you $200 if you do this job. So it can be varied.
This, you give me power.
But the reason reader promises build anticipation in books and literature is because of the fact that you are waiting for the promise to be fulfilled. For example, romance novels. What is the promise of almost every romance novel?
They die.
That's a tragedy.
Yeah.
Wrong genre. But with romance novels, it's generally they get together in the end. Even if they don't get married or anything like that, they at least are boyfriend, girlfriend. You know, they kiss. Mwah. That is the romance novel, right? Or at the end of the horror novel, the promise of a horror novel, right, is you will be
Someone
scared to
dies.
death and probably want to leave your light on for the rest of the night. That is your promise. And fantasy, generally your promise is that you will be whisked away into some sort of wonderful, mystical universe, right?
We're nice.
Wow, someone has an obsession with death today.
You should
Only
make it
today?
your own.
This thing goes on 24/7.
Oh boy. And then there's science fiction where the promise is generally that you're going to be whisked away into some sort of sciencey universe, and it's going to stay sciencey. You're not going to run into anything that you're very confused about generally. Generally, it's going to be, oh yes, we can explain this because of this physics principle and chemistry and blah. That's generally science fiction.
No.
That is only when genre bending, and we're going to talk about that here in a
Genre
second. So, I know, it sounds like some sort of Avatar Last
Day,
Airbender
yeah,
thing.
yeah.
Genre bending. Yeah, no, that's not what I'm talking about.
It's like, haha, you have a mystery coming your way. Eat that!
Poof. Oh boy. Yeah, and with mystery, generally we like the, semi-twist ending, or they're gonna catch the killer kind of thing, right? Unless it's a thriller, in which case the whole mystery is they solve the mystery and then possibly immediately die. So, see, every genre has their own promises, right? But so we're going to talk about the first thing, is actually talking about genre. So generally, with reader promises, you want to stick to your genre. However, the only time it's okay to genre bend is if you establish it from the very beginning. And by very beginning, I mean page 1, maximum page 2. That's as far as you can get before you can't establish genre bending anymore. If you don't establish genre bending by page 2, your reader is going to be disappointed and going to put the book down. Because they need to know. For example, if you're like, hey, it's science fiction, but they can't solve every problem because there are secretly supernatural beings, you need to establish that by page 2. Even if it's just a foreshadow of saying, so-and-so still believes in ghosts, even though I don't believe in it at all. We have way too much technology to have ghosts. That helps set up the idea that, ooh, maybe ghosts are real.
Think powers of technology.
And so as a result of that, it's like, it helps give you the idea that genre bending is going to be a thing. If you don't establish the genre bending early in page 1 or 2, then your readers are going to be disappointed later because they come into it with certain promises, right? If you come into a romance novel and you don't establish that it's genre bending, and you're like, it's a normal realistic fiction romance, and then you get to page, 100, and all of a sudden they're like, and then she just got eaten by a werewolf. You're gonna be like, what? However, if you established on page 2 she loves to read paranormal romances and she feels like this one guy, is kind of like mysterious and aloof, then you're like, ooh, maybe he actually is a paranormal figure. It doesn't have to be like a slap in the face kind of genre bending hint. It can just be like a very subtle genre bending, like, hey, maybe there's more to this.
And then they hovered on their hoverboard, and then they shot fire from their fingertips.
Yes, you got to make sure that you establish from the beginning there's more going on here than meets the eye. Otherwise, they're going to expect certain things from your genre, and if you don't establish the genre bend, then they're going to be a little bit confused, especially because for the people who are willing to explore more, they're probably going to be okay, but that's unfortunately not many. Most people go into a romance wanting X, Y, and Z, go into a sci-fi wanting X, Y, and Z. They have certain expectations. And if you break those expectations with no foreshadow, your reader feels kind of sad. Maybe they won't, maybe they will, but most of the time they feel kind of sad. This is where your fan fiction struggles. It's because oftentimes they think that they're immune from the rules and they're allowed to genre bend anytime they want just for the sake of their own interest. But that's not true. If you're going to genre bend, you got to make sure it's established. Especially if you're writing an actual novel. With fan fiction, you're totally fine. Pretty much break all the rules and you're fine if it's fan fiction. That's most of the time people are fine if it's fan fiction. The next point is keep your character consistent and their personality realistic. It's important that you establish realistic traits in their personality. You don't want it to be confusing. Because if you establish in their personality that they are generally a cheerful person, and then all of a sudden for no reason they explode with anger at their friend, that doesn't make sense. But on the other hand, if you properly foreshadow it and make sure that they know, like, they've been having a really bad week, they're super stressed, all this buildup, and then boom, that makes more sense. You got to make sure their character is consistent. And with that their personality is realistic. You also don't want to have them be too insensitive too. You don't want it to be like, oh yeah, I just totally cheated on you and stole your best friend or whatever. It's
that's
like
one of my
total
characters.
betrayal. And then they're like, it's fine, I forgive you. What?
Yeah, no, that's one of the role-playing things I have with my cousins.
Wait, who cheats on Vito?
No one cheats on Vito. Shut up. Okay, my apologies. But pretty much, I'm this like traitor. I ran away from the crown and like all this stuff. I like had the princess's father like paid him to disappear for 4 years.
Yeah.
It's great. And she's like, dude, you're still getting paid. And I'm like, why? Why am I getting paid for being a traitor?
Yep. That's fair.
But then again, to be fair, she's not a writer, so we're fine.
And that's
It was
okay.
still fun to act insane.
But yeah, with the character, you want to make sure it's consistent. If something terrible happens to them, they're going to be sad. Even if it's just a little sad. You know, you want to make sure and maybe they're shoving their feelings down. That's also very realistic too. Maybe they're like, oh, well, they're my best friend and I want them to be happy. Shove down feelings. That's realistic. Unfortunately, shouldn't be. Please don't bottle up your feelings. That's unhealthy. But
Well, you see, I bottle up my
People
feelings
can.
and then just write, and they all just, and then
That's
I
also fair.
ended
Writing
not
is a great way to
punching
cope.
this guy.
But yeah, so with
As
writing
much.
and flowing with the character, just make sure that their reactions are realistic. And if you want them to have some sort of mental health problem, whether it's so you want it to be a villain, for instance, and you want them to be a psycho serial killer or something like that, make sure you do your research. Because of the fact that the more research you do, the more realistic it will feel for your readers. And believe it or not, even if you're writing a fantasy novel, we appreciate realism as readers. We like to be able to feel like our fantasy could be real. And if our fantasy doesn't feel like it could be a realistic novel, that makes us sad. We're like, oh, well, it's clearly not real because everyone's too happy all the time.
No,
You gotta make sure that it feels like we could live there, we could be there, we could come together with these characters and it would feel like reality to us. Alright, the next thing that we're going to talk about is follow through with your resolution. So, this comes again to the surprise kind of idea. If you're going to do a surprise ending, make sure that you foreshadow it and that you give the proper cues and clues to your reader and that you follow through on that. And that if there isn't any sort of surprise ending like a romance novel, X and Y character are going to end up together in the end, even if it doesn't seem like it in the middle and they have some struggles. Make sure you follow through with that resolution and you're not just like, they're going to be together the whole novel and you're totally aware of it, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, oh yes, my ex-husband that was overseas, it turns out I love him. Bye, romantic interest from the entire novel. No, that's a problem. You're gonna upset every reader that you have. You're gonna be like, I shipped them so hard, and then this random hobo shows up, and you get married to him. Like, you gotta make sure that if that's gonna be the case, you foreshadow it. Once again, you make sure there are clues and hints. She's receiving love letters from some mysterious ex-husband, and she keeps throwing them away, but for some reason, the last few she's kept close. You know, you gotta make sure it's foreshadowed. It makes sense. Instead of just being like, and suddenly, that's where Deus Ex Machina comes in. You gotta make sure that it doesn't, you don't totally 180. That's why it feels like cheating when you do Deus Ex Machina. Because you're trying to force an ending on the reader that you did not promise. You gotta make sure you stick to your promises, even if there were unintentional promises. This is where editors can be really helpful, because editors can say, oh hey, I was really looking forward to you having this scene with spaghetti. You're like, what do you mean? And they're like, well, they keep talking about this being their favorite food and that they love spaghetti, and you know, they're here this whole time and they keep talking about how their families are going to get together, and then they never get together and have spaghetti. And you're like, oh, I didn't even realize that, I just did it for fun. And it's like, no, my reader wants the spaghetti scene. Or whatever.
Write me a spaghetti scene.
I need it.
Yeah, write me a spaghetti scene or I'll sue you for $3,000.
Will you shut up?
Someone needs someone. I don't have that much money. Anyway,
Someone needs PBS Kids shoved in his face.
but anyway, so with following through to the resolution, you got to make sure that your resolution is properly foreshadowed, and then if it's not properly foreshadowed and you're gonna do kind of a 180 thing, you got to make sure it's at least subtly foreshadowed, even if it's just something simple, like we were talking about with foreshadowing earlier. Maybe the murderer is watering these flowers, and you're like, why are we focusing on these flowers so much? But then later they reveal those are monkshood flowers, and they are known as a type of poison. And it's like, oh, so that's why we were talking about the flowers so long. You got to make sure that even if it's not obvious to the reader, you make it so the reader has to pay attention to it, even if they don't want to, and therefore in the back of their mind they're constantly going, why did they do that?
Why the
Red
flowers?
herrings are good
He
too.
likes
Red herrings are good too, absolutely. We did. We also talked about that in the suspense category, where with red herrings, it is incredibly important to have them because of the fact that you want to make sure that anticipation is built by your reader being like, what? Totally looking in the wrong direction. Murderer with the stabby knife is over here, and they're busy looking over here. That helps build anticipation, especially if you make it a touch obvious that it's a red herring. Then you as a reader are screaming, freaking, no, it's not him. Whereas they're just like, it's obviously him. And that can build anticipation too, absolutely, with red herrings. Let's see, what else? The last thing that I was going to talk about. Yes. And then, as we mentioned before with genre bending, stick to your theme. And by theme, I mean specific themes within books. These are subgenres. So, for example, if your novel is a romance action, then that means you still have to have an action plot by the end of the book. You gotta keep following through with that. You can't just be like, it's a romance plot with a spy thriller subplot, and then all of a sudden the spy thriller subplot dies halfway through the novel. You gotta keep them going the
my
same
spy!
pace. Yes, your spy just suddenly, bam, keels over and dies. And it's
My spy! Michael!
So, or like with science fiction or medieval fantasy. If you have medieval fantasy, make sure that you're not suddenly like, in the medieval fantasy novel, cell phones work.
What?
You're like,
But Princess Bride works.
with Princess Bride, though, the reason why it works is because of the fact that they still stick to a theme. That they establish from the beginning that this is a genre-bending theme, right? And so that's why it works so well with Princess Bride, and that's why we all enjoy Princess Bride so much,
my
is
gosh,
because
it's
there
so good.
are so many twists and turns that are not typical to the medieval fantasy genre, but we're okay with it being not typical to the genre because of the fact that it's already been established, that we're already aware of it from the beginning. And also the interruptions with the kid are just hilarious. If you've ever watched the movie, please, if you haven't watched that movie, watch that.
Watch
movie.
it.
I've read the book though, and they have interruptions just like that.
Oh, really? That's fun. I haven't actually read the book. It's on my bucket list. It's one of the very, very many books on my bucket list. Anyway.
I have an entire
Oh.
sticky note that's like, books I want to read, books I want to read again, books I want to own, series is to own.
Oh, yeah.
It's a problem.
It's forever. It's forever. If you like reading at all, it's forever. You're stuck,
It's
you
never
know?
gonna stop. You're not gonna get to all of them unless you're just a complete hermit and just.
Yep. And you just
Next
never
book.
leave your house.
Even then,
Or eat.
doesn't
You just
work.
read until you pass out. So, we're at about 45 minutes with the lesson. Do you guys have any questions you want to ask, or do we want to just wrap this up? Questions about building anticipation in stories.
Yeah, could you just repeat that?
Repeat the whole lesson. I promise it's on YouTube. Yes.
when should you start this? Like the
When should you start the anticipation?
main anticipation?
Depends on what you're going for. For example, if you are going for humor, you should establish from the beginning that it's going to be a humorous book. Otherwise, people who don't like to have humor in their books as much and want it to be serious are going to be very thrown off by the humor. Whereas with the surprise can be foreshadowed pretty much whenever you want, as long as it's decently early on. So by decently early on, I mean like within the first 50 to 60 pages. So take your time with surprises, because generally with surprises you want to litter seeds of it throughout your book at various times. It shouldn't be like boom, 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 we have all the clues, but for some reason it still takes us 200 pages to solve the murder. Why? So with surprises, I would say generally anytime you want, as long as it's within the first 100 pages for sure. Then I would say with suspense, generally in order to build up that suspenseful anticipation, you want it again within at least the first 50 to 60 pages. Depends on how suspenseful you want it. If you want it super intense to the point where your readers are like feeling like they are in mortal danger despite the fact that they're reading a novel, then start from the very beginning, page 1. However, if you want it to be, so that's more thriller, horror type of stuff where you want to start from page 1 with kind of a creepy, eerie thing going on. But if you want something more that's just suspenseful because you're like, oh no, are they actually going to live through this? Then you can start almost any time you want, as long as it's about 1/4 of the way into the book, depending on how long your book is. Humor, again, I'd probably say start from the beginning just to establish that it's going to be a goofy book, because not everyone likes goofy. I mean, 90% of people do, but there are still some people who are like, I want my fantasy to be serious fantasy. And then with reader promises, depends on the thing. If you're talking about character, then you gotta make sure your character is consistent from the very beginning, page 1. Same thing with and then with your genre, if you're gonna genre bend, page 1. Page 2, absolute maximum, if you're needing to stretch it out. And if you're going to do any sort of theme bending, so like, for example, adding unicorns into your sci-fi or whatever, you gotta make sure that's established within the first 10 pages, I'd probably say. And then with following through in your resolution, again, it depends. So with following through in your resolution, you just got to make sure you promise a resolution. Even if you change it at the end, you got to make sure that as long as it's well foreshadowed, you have a promised resolution that you then foreshadow whether or not it's going to work. So, sorry, it's a different answer for every genre. So I'd probably say pick a genre, then re-ask me that question, purely because of the fact that it is totally different for each genre and for what you're trying to go for. Surprise, suspense, humor, reader promises, those are all going to be different things that you got to take into account. Granted, also, I'm going to mention it for like the 400th time, but it's important that I mention it. Relax. This is all stuff to make your writing better, absolutely, but it's to make your writing better up front. We have editors for a reason. And that is because you aren't expected to know all of this from the beginning. If you do, better for you, like go for it. But at the same time, just relax, let your writer's instinct guide you, and then if you need to go back and fix it later, you can. Brandon Sanderson absolutely goes back and foreshadows in post. He never does it in the beginning. He always does it after he's already finished writing it all. So as a result of that, I would say those are my recommendations, but at the same time, write what you're gonna write, and then later if you're like, oh, I don't foreshadow it till page 100 and I need, it to be way earlier, you can fix that. Okay. So, all right, any other questions that we have here? We all good? We feeling good? Okay.